We all come from a culture and we're not one-dimensional beings. But what happens when certain aspects of the culture you belong is in direct conflict with who you are innately? How do you reconcile that conflict to affirm the totality of yourself? What does it even mean to affirm yourself? Well, to affirm self is to accept and honor what you feel is true and valid for you. This is actually the first step to affirming others, or accepting and honoring what others feel is true and valid for them. This is important because sometimes we mistake agreeing with others as affirming them, but that's not what it means to affirm someone. To affirm others basically just means that we need to accept what that person feels is true and valid for them. Only accept it. We don't have to agree with it. I developed the self-solstice model of affirmation out of a desire to truly learn to affirm myself, but also because of my reflection on the question, what does it truly mean to affirm other people? This model is built on the work of Dr. Claude Steele, a social psychologist who in the 1980s developed the self-affirmation theory. And according to this theory, we are driven to protect ourselves as being seen as good and moral. In other words, we are driven to protect our self-integrity. And when threatened, we attempt to protect our self-integrity or preserve our sense of self. But what is self? The self is both the container and center of individual consciousness. Again, the self is both the container and center of individual consciousness. As I said previously, we all come from a culture, our extrinsic selves, that part of us that is connected to the norms, rules, and traditions of our family, our friends, our social organizations, our work, etc. But this container, this receptacle for one's awareness of how they exist in the world, includes feelings, thoughts, actions, experiences, and memories, and all the elements that comprise a person's uniqueness and sense of identity. And at the center is the self's core, the perceptible soul, which must be benefited and cared for. But if we go back to self-affirmation theory, it suggests that we all have a self system, a psychological immune system, if you will. And the role of this system is to protect our self-worth when our self-integrity is threatened. When our self-integrity is threatened, we oftentimes will respond very defensively to reduce the threat. We may avoid, we may deny, we may even change our appraisal of the threat to make it seem less threatening. But when we learn to affirm ourselves, the self-system kicks into self-worth enhancement rather than self-worth protection. In other words, in this way, we can better cope with threatening events and information rather than resorting to defensiveness. So through 4 stages, the self-solstice model of affirmation is a guide through self-worth enhancement via examination and healing of what we find threatening and affirmation of self and others. So for the purposes of this model, threats will be referred to as wounds or woundedness. So if you hear me say, things that may have wounded you, you know that I'm referring to threats. But this model demonstrates the innate nature of self-affirmation and places self at the center of all stages. We have to remember that the self is the center of the soul, which is also the core of the self. And the soul is perceptive, and it requires nurturing to for self to evolve authentically. So the first stage of the self-solstice model of affirmation is self-examination. We can't heal what we don't reveal. Are you all familiar with that adage? Well, this stage is a prerequisite for healing. Self-examination involves exploration of the soul, the self's center, and all that one's sense of identity contains. Exploration of self allows us to recognize and develop a consciousness of our self-concept. And typically, self-concept is deeply connected to self-integrity as well as self-image. So when we start thinking about self-examination, one of the things that we have to think about is, how we see ourselves and the authenticity and the consistency of how we present to others, especially in response to feelings about self, others, self in relation to others, as well as differences and sameness. Let's face it, for many of us, sustaining our authenticity and consistency is extremely challenging. Doable, yet challenging, particularly when we think about how some of the messages we receive from external sources significantly impact how and what we communicate to ourselves internally about ourselves. Both external and internal messages that we receive about how things should be or how things ought to be contribute to how we perceive disappointments and setbacks, as well as how authentically and adaptively we respond. This is why self-examination is critical. It is a time to reflect upon our relationship with self, particularly since so much of how we relate with others is dependent on our relationship with ourselves. But there is a technique to this. During self-evaluation, we must acknowledge our positive self-traits, as well as those self-traits that pose challenges, limitations, and woundedness, or those feelings, thoughts, actions, experiences that are painful, but also contribute to the overall composite of our self-concept. We all want to be seen as good and appropriate, but sometimes we end up getting stuck in feelings of and thoughts and experiences that make us feel less than good or appropriate. Self-examination helps give equilibrium to this. This model requires us to examine ourselves independently of external distractions. In other words, it means that we have to sit with ourselves without Facebook, without Twitter, without TikTok, without Instagram, without our telephones, without our friends. We have to sit with self. And much like the solstice, where the sun appears to pause before moving into its next cycle, this experience of aloneness is a deliberate pause to connect with our intrinsic self, the soul. Okay. So I'm going to return back to my personal journey. 2 weeks before I started my master's program, and as I was sitting here preparing for this class, one of the things that I realized is that 2 weeks seems to be a reoccurring theme in my life for some reason. I hadn't quite figured that out yet, but it tends to be a reoccurring theme for me. But 2 weeks before I was to start my master's program, my father passed away. I was 25 years old. My father and I were extremely close. And despite his transitioning, I made the decision that I was going to start school anyway. That was one of the many worst mistakes I ever made in my life. At the end of the first semester, I found myself on academic probation. And immediately, I started feeling anxiety, shame, disappointment, and really and truly just not feeling good enough. So what did I do? I decided, you know what? I'm just going to leave the program. I am not going to give these people, a reason to try to kick me out of here. I'm not even going to let them do that. I'm just going to leave. I'm going to go up here and withdraw. Well, luckily for me, the day I went to withdraw, I saw the chair of the program. And she said to me, you know what? Rather than withdrawing, why don't you just take a leave of absence? Well, first of all, I didn't even realize that was an option for me. But her logic was, if you leave, take some time to grieve and get yourself together. That way, if you want to come back, by taking a leave of absence, you can come back, you can appeal the academic probation, and you can have it overturned. Now, you'll have to start the program all over, and the grades that you have currently will stay on your transcript. But if you just withdraw and you decide you want to come back later, we're not going to let you in with these grades. Listen, who knew that time away and healing would change a girl's perspective? I left. I came back about a year later. I restarted the program, and I was able to finish with a GPA of 3.6. And then I was faced with those damn comprehensive exams. I was not happy. For 5 hours, we had to sit writing to demonstrate mastery of 2 years worth of coursework and practice. 5 hours. Now, I haven't been able to figure out whether or not the program was sadist or if I was masochist for putting myself through the punishment, but I'll let y'all figure that out. I'll let y'all be the judge of that. Anyway, on the day that I was supposed to take my comps, my stomach felt queasy. And to be real honest with you, I just chalked it all up to the fact that, I ate all this pizza and I drank a lot of Mountain Dew the night before. And so, I'll be fine. But the other thing that happened on the day that I was supposed to take my comps, I also became almost obsessed with finding the right pen. And it meant that I spent almost an hour and a half in 2 different stores on 2 different pen aisles looking for the right pen. Now, mind you, one of the stores I went in was an office supply store. And if you've ever been in an office supply store, you know that they have a whole aisle filled with nothing but writing utensils. And I stood on that aisle for almost 45 minutes and I could not find a pen. Right? Yeah. I look at myself the same way now. But now what I realized that I didn't realize then is that I was experiencing anxiety.